give the call to Member for Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I have to say, quite frequently, the member for Macarthur and I are in furious agreement. And that's because we're both paediatricians and we both understand the healthcare system, including the public healthcare system, and we both understand the difficulties that this country has faced with regards to the COVID pandemic, which is not just something that's happened here in Australia, but it's happened right around the world. But in this instance, unfortunately, I have to violently disagree with the member for Macarthur's private member's motion here today. In fact, I find it quite astounding, as someone who sits on National Health COVID response committees, for him to actually put into writing this particular motion. And the reason I say that is I do understand that the member for Macarthur knows how difficult the situation has been globally in the last 2 years. And I would say that I'm disappointed because this is about Labor having to talk down the COVID response. Now, I do understand in opposition it is important that you pick out things that you'd like to point out or highlight, and it is true that this has been an awfully difficult period of Australia's history. But if we take a step back as a country and look at the leadership that the federal government, the Morrison government, has provided to Australia, it is quite simply extraordinary. And that leadership starts with understanding from the very get-go that Australia as a country was going to have to learn to live with the virus. We knew that this was here to stay. And this is a Prime Minister who had the maturity to realise this wasn't a short-term 2-week, it will be over in 2 weeks approach, that it was going to be a very different approach in the months, weeks, months and years to come. And secondly, I think the Prime Minister's leadership was clearly shown that he understood the balance between lives and livelihoods, that we need to be able to get the balance right. That saving lives was absolutely essential. Every life needs to be saved. But the impact of this COVID pandemic on livelihoods also needed to be in consideration. Unlike premiers, who are actually being assessed for their impact on healthcare outcomes, the federal government is being judged both on health and economic outcomes. And so with that in mind, we acted quickly, we acted decisively, and throughout this pandemic, we've acted to critical issues responsively, flexibly and nimbly. And that started with the closure of the international borders. It moved through to the development of National Cabinet, which has brought together all the state and territory leaders with the federal government. There's been an enormous amount of work on expert committees. The member for Macarthur and myself sit on one of these bipartisan expert committees, which enables all of the experts in Australia to provide information, expert evidence to government. And that's been incredibly important. But what has been one of the biggest bugbears for Australia is the issue of securing our supply chains. And there's absolutely no doubt that there have been rolling critical issues about supply chains. And that started right back in March 2020, when we had issues as a country with obtaining personal protective equipment. It's hard to remember now, but we had problems with masks. We were running out of masks. We've had problems with toilet paper. We've had problems with all sorts of things with regards to sovereign supply. And the Minister for Health, under the guidance of the Prime Minister, had secured these supply chains by stepping up local manufacturing capability. And then there was the COVID PCR test in April 2020. It's again hard to believe these things. And we were moving at speed to respond with diligence and care to all of these things. But then we moved to, more recently, the vaccine rollout, which we have now delivered ahead of time, actually. So the COVID vaccine rollout was, in fact, I was in the media talking about I was hoping that we might have Freedom Day by Melbourne Cup. In fact, we had Freedom Day well ahead of that because the vaccine rollout had difficulties, absolutely no doubt about that. But with the hard work of this government, was able to deliver the outcomes for this country that was so vitally needed. Now, we moved to rapid antigen tests. There is no doubt that the PCR testing for COVID was the gold standard for Delta. We needed aggressive suppression because Delta had a much higher mortality rate and had a different underlying set of data behind it. But when you look at Omicron, it's been more important to move to RAT testing, to have more rapid access to rapid antigen testing. And there is no doubt that this government has moved very quickly in a number of weeks to rolling out RATs and to making sure that general community can have access. We've also made sure that the fringe benefit tax availability for businesses means that businesses can use them more readily. And we've also made sure there's concessional card support for those who can least afford it. It is worth mentioning that this government has provided an excellent outcome for Australia. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.